But there is some evidence that, there were some early fungi on Earth but way back in the Devonian period, which was like 400 million years ago. And right when plants were making their way onto land. So plants evolved mostly in the water, in the marine environments. And then they crept slowly onto land. And land at that time was just this like barren rock, right? Didn't even have soil yet, because soil is decomposing life, plants and fungi and invertebrates and animals, and all of these things hadn't really evolved to live on land yet. So as plants are transitioning onto the rock, basically onto the earth, out of the water, part of there's a selective pressure on one hand for plants to make that step, because there was like more available sunlight. Certain gases are easier to like diffuse across their tissues if they have exposure to air. And so there are ways in which that can be an advantage for the plant. But a disadvantage for the plant would be that it's like the water basically provides a really stable environment. I mean, even if it's open water, right? You have like it's a little bit more regular, like the temperature and the protection from extreme UV light, and you're not worried about losing too much water through osmosis, like leaking water, right? After it evaporates out of you in the harsh sun. But fungi, we think, were able to sort of facilitate this transition, at least in some cases and partially, by sort of helping the plants move into this earthly environment. Fungi were able to grow in ways that sort of helped the plants, help them break down this like the nitrogen and phosphorus in the rock, and help them kind of gather up water more efficiently, and basically establish what became these long-term partnerships. So we don't know if in the early days if the plant was being infected by the fungus. Maybe originally there was some of that. But what we do believe is that this relationship has been mutually beneficial for a really, really long time. Nonetheless, like there's so little discussion in ecology around mutualisms until we get into the last couple of decades. So even though we have some evidence that they are extremely old key evolutionary events that like have completely fundamentally shaped life on Earth, it's still this realm of biology that's like under discussed. And I think that has changed, but it's still that way, right? When I was starting to study fungi, about 15 years ago, it was common to meet people who were botanists who really did not understand mycorrhizal fungi, even though that they're, again, 90% of terrestrial plants have these types of partnerships. And I mentioned earlier that this idea of symbiosis really started to take shape when scientists were looking at lichens. And lichens are a type of fungus. They live basically as a consortium, a community with fungal tissue and algae, and which can photosynthesize. And when scientists were looking at that, they were like, well, this is like multiple things living together, but you can't separate them and reduce them into their component parts and fundamentally understand them. But like they would be, if you separated them, like it wouldn't exist anymore. And this idea was put forward that it's a collective, it's symbiosis. And it wasn't even necessarily defining symbiosis like as again like a good or bad thing. It was just like maybe part of this is hurting the other, who knows, but it doesn't matter, like these organisms are somehow like unintelligible, right, without each other. But so even though this was proposed in the late 1800s, it took many decades for people to start to take that idea seriously. And you started to see how it was flying in the face of sort of not only just conventional knowledge and wisdom, but also some like very deep rooted worldviews, right? And we started to touch on this last week, right? How the way in which science is always happening and being carried out in a given cultural context. And that culture that science is happening within, whether it's from 200 years ago or happening today, is always going to some degree, mediate the knowledge as it's, filtering into the brain of the scientist, and as it's filtering out of the brain of the scientist, right? Or the scientific community.